Well, good day everyone. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you very much for this kind invitation, Jeremy. Actually replying kind. You are a wonderful person, and I feel very encouraged by your friendship and that of your friends and everyone here. Yeah, well, we had a conversation last week, Jeremy and I, about well, things of this world, or things rather of this culture, and we realized that many things that we think about are construed somehow in dichotomies, either or. And this is how this title came up, Creation or Evolution. And of course, maybe you already got it. I hope to prove that that's the wrong way of asking the question. At least that's what I'll try to do. You'll tell me if my attempt was successful. And then there's a subtitle there showing that I'll be looking at this topic from the viewpoint of early Christian readings of Genesis 1. And of course, these are two different topics. Genesis 1 is scriptural narrative, most times misunderstood in popular Christianity, but not only in popular Christianity, but also in well, ideological milieus, people that have agendas against Christianity, for instance, bias against Christianity. You know, they use Genesis a lot. Sometimes they know more about Genesis than most Christians would. And that's a topic in itself. And of course, early Christian views or early Christian representations of Genesis or interpretations of Genesis, that's a different topic altogether. Why I refer to early Christian interpretations or readings of Genesis 1, it's because on the one hand, that's my kind of expertise. On the other hand, I believe that if there's something that Christians have lost in time, in history, is the wisdom of centuries past. I believe that the early Christians were far smarter than we are today, at least on this front. Just the other day, I was browsing the internet to see what marvels I can find, and there you go, there's new research popping up. I found this article by a team, I think they are from Switzerland or something, Germans, French stuff. Creationism and conspiracism share a common teleological bias, published in a scientific journal, Current Biology, just a few days ago. Very new. And some thoughts, an interpretation, if you like, of this science. The second title there, why creationists are more likely to buy into conspiracy theories, published in Life Science, which is a blog. You'll ask me why this kind of beginning. Well, it's because we have a case of, say, research, or the outcomes of which the researching in the first instance, and the interpretation of those outcomes with a certain bias, the second case. Pretty much the first title there is, well, I think inoffensive. It's something that is digestible. You look at it, if you have the tools, you can try to assess the validity of the assumptions, the validity of the method, the validity of the outcomes, you know. You can do that, and there's nothing to worry about. That's, well, a scientific exercise. The second one, however, is a story. It's an interpretation of the facts with a bias. And the bias is, although the author doesn't say it so plainly, the bias is anti-Christian. We are nuts. We are all creationists, we are all conspiracists. And that's because we have this kind of childish mentality that things must have a purpose. Teleology is a fancy term coming from the Greek. Telos means purpose or goal. Yeah? We have this infantile mentality, and we believe that all things should have a purpose. There should be a reason for something or that. Yeah? And according to this interpretation by whatever that author, we are infantile, we are childish, we cannot think properly, and we live for as long as we stay here on earth with this kind of mentality that things must have a purpose, because this is how grannies and daddies and mothers and all that told us when we were kids. Well, I believe that this kind of situation isn't unique, and we have seen so many times in the last few decades with the rise of new atheism, not only the scientific discourse as such, we have seen the scientific discourse displayed or actually dispatched in ideological wrappings. The God delusion and all that, Dawkins and that, yeah? According to this ideological narrative, we Christians are nuts. But are we? First of all, teleology, the idea of a purpose, or believing that there is a purpose to this existence, is not only for conspiracy theorists. I think this is a mockery, and it shows the bias. It's just a mockery. Teleology is a serious thing. Look at things and go beyond their usefulness and look at their purpose. Yeah? That's no childish play. For instance, I don't want to impress you with my Wikipedia awareness, but there's this guy Heidegger, you know, famous philosopher of last century, who has put metaphysics back on track by changing the first question in metaphysics. You know, ancient metaphysics or classical metaphysics asked about the nature of things. What is truly real? That was the fundamental question in ancient metaphysics. With the rise of science in modern times, that question was no longer answered by the philosophers. It was answered by physicists, chemists, and so on and so forth, scientists. And what remains as a province for philosophers was, well, epistemology, whatever, talking about words and that. Heidegger had the intuition of something that was missing in the narrative, the modern narrative. And that was the topic of purpose. And you know his famous question, why is there something rather than nothing? That's a question, the new question, the new fundamental question in modern metaphysics. And it has a teleological tinge. It points to a purpose. So teleology is not for conspiracists and stuff like that, you know? It's a serious thing to think beyond usefulness, beyond the description of things, to look at what things are made for. What is their purpose? What's the purpose of existence, and so on and so forth? Why is this childish? Because I'm not agnostic, I'm not infantile. Teleology is also part of some segments of contemporary cosmology. For instance, if you talk to a normal cosmologist, he or she will tell you upfront that the destiny of the universe, the final destiny of the universe was already written in the first very few microseconds of the universe, of the universe's existence. So it was already there, and the universe goes through whatever time, or together with time, I guess, according to a pre-established kind of trajectory. The initial conditions of the universe dictate the final destiny of the universe. The fact that we don't know the final destiny of the universe is the outcome of the fact that we have almost no idea of the initial conditions. You know that. As a matter of fact, you know about our mighty science, you know? We are very, very good at camouflaging things. You know how much do you know about the universe? According to conservative estimates, no more than 20%. But most scientists, cosmologists mainly will say, well, we know some stuff, but there's a lot of dark matter there, there's a lot of dark energy there. It's more like 80% or more than 80% of the entire universe is dark. What's that dark? Childish play? What's that dark? Anyway, so we know a lot. But anyway, the fact that teleology isn't absent from modern metaphysics and contemporary cosmology shows that we aren't nuts, we aren't stupid because we believe in the purpose of existence, even though maybe it's not so easy to discern that purpose. So let's forget about conspiracism, because I'm not interested in it, although some of the theories are quite interesting, of course. And ask again, are we nuts? And the second topic that is discussed in that article and its interpretation is creationism. Creationists are naive. And yeah, I have to agree, yeah, creationists are naive. But my question is, are we creationists? To uphold the doctrine of creation, the Christian doctrine of creation, amounts to being a creationist. I don't think so, and that's what I'll try to prove today. I believe that Christians believing in the doctrine of creation are not necessarily creationists and therefore are not nuts. How do we get rid of creationism? Well, that's my proposal, schematized. What I propose is that we must distinguish between creation and creationism, between evolution and evolutionism. It's so easy to confuse these words in our discourse, whether we are believers or atheists. We confuse these words and we think creation is creationism, evolution is evolutionism. I believe it's not so. And that's my proposal. What's creation? Creation is a theological representation of reality. By creation, I mean the doctrine of creation. Its main question is who made this? You know? In the beginning, God made. I believe in one God, Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Who made it? Who made the universe? You know? That's the doctrine of creation. I know there are many articulations, and in 2,000 years of Christian development, history, we managed to refine our understanding of the doctrine of creation. But in the main, the doctrine of creation is this. In the beginning, God made. In other words, the main question of the doctrine of creation, or in the doctrine of creation, is who? That's not a question that has anything to do with any science, unless you want to do some psychology. Creationism addresses a very different question. Creationism is not about who. It's about what. It's about technology. What happened? How did it go? To cut it short, I suggest that creationism is a supernaturalist ideology, where the only agent at work is God, and God operates supernaturalistically, does this, and it happens. Maybe that's how things happen, but how do we know? And this is why I believe it's important to look back in time at the wisdom of the early Christians to see how they asked this question. And I'll be dismissing this second question. I don't believe in it. I don't believe a Christian needs this question answered in order to believe in creation. In other words, my proposal is that, yes, we Christians believe in the doctrine of creation, but we don't have to be creationists. Evolution is a scientific description of reality. Flawed, you know. Do we know more than 80%? I don't know. Maybe we know even less about biology, about anthropology, and that. We discover all the time, you know, glands that were hidden within our body, which we think we know. Anyway, like anything that human beings create, it's an ongoing process. I am ready to accept that this is a scientific description of reality, I mean evolution, that things move and change. What I'm not ready to accept, however, is evolutionism, which is a dogma, which is an interpretation of that science in naturalist terms. It's a naturalist ideology. It's the opposite of creationism. In creationism, the only agent at work is God. God does this, God does that. Like the prime mover of Aristotle, you know, God puts the whole machinery in motion, and afterwards God intervenes from time to time, impromptu, to fix things or whatever. Prompt the world on I don't know what quest. Evolutionism is a naturalist ideology. It doesn't believe in any divine agency. It excludes any thought about divine agency. It reduces everything to the movement of nature, matter, its inattentions, and so on and so forth. As I said, I would go for evolution if that's the paradigm of our time, but I'll never go for evolutionism. I hope I make my case clear. So, how do we proceed? I believe that creationism as a supernaturalist ideology and evolutionism as a naturalist ideology cannot be breached. They suffer a fundamental flaw. They work in terms of either or. Either nature or God. In creationism, just God. In evolutionism, just nature. Could creation and evolution, in other words, the doctrine of creation and the theory of evolution, be breached? I believe that they can. But we need to learn how to look at this situation. It's a matter of looking differently at the same reality. What we look at is this world. What we look at is life on earth. What we look at is us human beings. But how do we look at these things? There's a theological viewpoint, drawing on the doctrine of creation, and answers the question, who? I look at palm trees, koalas, people, stars. Who made all these? And my answer is God. I believe in one God, Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. That's the doctrine of creation. That's a theological viewpoint. But there's a scientific viewpoint, theory of evolution, which tries to answer the question, what? What is happening? And there are processes. Some say macroevolution, some say microevolution. That's already a language that is far above my state. But that's the paradigm. That's the culture of our time. What I try to point out is the fact that we can look at things, whether a koala or a palm tree or anything else, from both viewpoints. And that there is a scientific description of things, the phenomena, and there's a theological interpretation of the same realities. I believe that Christians are not creationists. I believe that we don't have to uphold the idea of literal technology of creation, according to which God acts arbitrarily by way of supernaturalist punches. That's not how the early Christians have looked at Genesis 1. That's not how the doctrine of creation, as articulated by the Creed, looks at things. There's no description there as to how things happen. There's just a reference to God, who made all these. But nor are Christians evolutionists. They do not believe that the natural processes are devoid of divine planning, activity, and foresight. God is involved throughout the process. This is why I believe that we should look at Genesis 1 from a different perspective than popular culture, and see how it has been interpreted by the early Christians, which, surprisingly, is a far smarter way to look at things. Before that, before anything, Genesis 1. According to current knowledge, Genesis 1 is not a narrative where things go from introduction, stage 1, stage 2 to conclusion. First of all, it's a poem. It's a liturgical poem written according to the rules of Hebrew literature. If you're familiar with genres and tropes and that, there's something called chiasm, coming from the Greek letter chi, pronounced ki in English, which shows how, say, you have two objects and they look at one another, they mirror one another. This is why I put it in the brackets, mirroring. Genesis 1 is a typical case of mirroring story. It's not something that you read from 1 to 7. I'll show you how we should look at it. As a poem, Genesis 1 was used in the synagogal liturgy and also for meditation, for contemplation. It's how, for instance, we use Genesis 1 in the Orthodox Church. We read Genesis 1 in only a few instances throughout the liturgical year. Significantly, the first time we look at it is in the first week of Lent, when we start our spiritual struggles and our spiritual remaking towards Easter. We begin by contemplating Genesis 1. Why? And so on and so forth. That's how Genesis 1 looks. We have a frame. It's the first verse, which encapsulates the doctrine of creation. In the beginning, God made heaven and earth. Yeah? And we have the end of the narrative, which is in the next chapter. In the Orthodox Church, we believe that that narrative ends with verse 3. In the Western Church, that narrative ends with verse 4, first part, 4a. The difference is minor. What matters is the fact that we have, from that first theological statement, in the beginning God made heaven and earth, we have the other, if you have the closing bracket, with God's Sabbath, God's rest in the creation, which means not the absence of God, which means not the inactivity of God. God's rest in the creation is presence. Presence. So Genesis 1 begins with the proclamation of God as the agent of creation, the source of all things, without whom there is nothing in existence. And it ends with the proclamation of God's love towards the creation, God's Sabbath, God's presence. Shabbat in Hebrew means to rest upon, to be present in. Sabbath means presence, not absence, not inactivity, to be present in, to find joy in the creation. It's a very different story. It has nothing to do with science. Yeah? It's a very different story, a very different viewpoint. It has nothing scientific about it. This is why I told you the doctrine of creation is beautiful and we Christians should not be ashamed of. It casts a beautiful light upon things, upon reality. This kind of light doesn't collide with anything, any philosophy, any science. We are independent from this viewpoint. But what happens in between? Genesis 1 can be read. We should read it, of course. It's how the text comes on the page, you know. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But in reality, if we look at the text more closely, we see that the days of creation are organized as though in a mirror. There's two columns. I call it the first one, the first 3 days, the columns, the column of separations or distinctions, if you like, and the second one, days 4, 5, 6, the embellishments or organization, if you like. What gives you a clue as to this arrangement is the fact that if you look at the divine commandments in each of the 6 days, you'll see how day 1, day 4, day 2, day 5, day 3, day 6 contain a similar amount or identical amount of commandments. 1, 4, 2, 5, just one commandment. 3, 6, 2 commandments. So I think this is a very strong clue that there is something happening there, that the story isn't something that you read 1, 2, 3, 6. Yeah? The days of creation mirror each other. What happens in the first column, the first 3 days of creation? Separation of things, clarification, if you like. In the beginning, it was a chaos. And then God said, let there be light, and there was light. That's the distinction between light and darkness, whatever that means. But because of my hobby, which is cosmology, I looked at things and found, for instance, in a very interesting 4th century church father, St. Gregory of Nyssa, an interpretation of the original chaos, which is very similar to what we modern people would conceive about chaos. And light for him was a physical phenomenon signifying organization, the organization of the universe. Anyway, if the light of day 1 is the expanse of the universe, we have this expanse populated by the celestial bodies of the 4th day. It's more difficult with the 2nd day. Let's go to the 3rd day. In the 3rd day, we have another separation between dry land and the ocean. And we have in the 6th day, the mirroring day, we have terrestrial animals, animals that inhabit that dry land. Yeah? So, according to the same logic, if we look at day 5, where we have birds, things flying in the air, the atmosphere, and fish and other aquatic animals, then what's the content of the second day? The second day is the most enigmatic because of a metaphor used in the text. God made the firmament, separating the waters above the firmament from the waters below the firmament. What are the waters above the firmament? I believe that's the atmosphere, where the birds fly. Yeah? Anyway, this is a way of looking at Genesis that spares you the trouble of trying to fix things from a generation to another. You know, as things go, the sciences change. We have the same doctrine of creation since centuries ago. Yeah? But the sciences change. When the early Christians, 3rd century, 4th century, had to deal with the doctrine of creation in the context of their world, of their culture, they had to use such concepts as the concentric spheres of Ptolemaios, and so on and so forth. The world was, or the universe was something that could be traveled in a few weeks or something. You have a good horse, and riding your horse, you can go from an edge of the world to the other end of the world in a few weeks. That was the universe. Then the universe sort of grew larger and larger to the extent that today we don't know if it has any confines. But because the sciences change, we are tempted to sort of bridge the gap and rush into making room for the doctrine of creation. Okay, so like every 10 years or so, we have a major scientific breakthrough in cosmology or biology or something, you know. And what do? Up until then, we Christians explain that phenomenon in this way. All of a sudden, we have nothing to say about it. And this was a phenomenon that started to be felt, a pressure, if you like, that was experienced by Christians very early on, 17th century, 18th century. They started to plant their God in the gaps of the scientific narrative of the time. Where the sciences cannot reach, that's where God is. It's the so-called theory of the God of the gaps. And the gaps grow less and less. Because that was our mistake, or the mistake of our Christian forebears. It was a mistake to plant God in some enclave, some lost islands there, where we thought the sciences would never reach. That was a wrong approach. But if you look at Genesis in this way, as a liturgical poem, which doesn't read from 1 to 7, reads from bracket 1 to bracket 7, and in between you have two sets of 3 days that mirror each other, then you don't have the trouble. You don't have to explain yourself, because Genesis doesn't offer you a scientific knowledge of the universe and life and ourselves. It's a theological viewpoint. That's why I don't believe that we Christians have to be creationists or evolutionists or God knows what else. You know, they have invented so many things in the last 50 years that I got dizzy when I started to look at it. In short, Genesis is neither a rigorous account of the facts nor a scientific report. It conveys a theological message about the origin, structure, and purpose of all things. And this is an understanding that most early Christian theologians would share. And now I look at a few cases from the early Christian centuries. I believe I begin with a 2nd century author, Clement the Alexandrian. Sometimes you find his name rendered as Clement of Alexandria, but usually in ecclesiastical terms, when you say of a city, that's the bishop of the city. Clement was never a bishop. In his work, Stromatis, which usually is translated as miscellanies, so a variety of things. He says something like this. According to the rule of truth, or rather the highest vision, within Gnostic tradition, he used a lot the word Gnostic, the discourse on nature begins with the exposition on cosmogony to then ascend to the theological perspective. It's a fancy vocabulary, sorry for my translation. I fiddle with Clement since some years now, preparing a book, and I thought I should give it a go in terms of trying to render what he says in, well, something that looks like an intelligible version to me at least. What he says, simply put, is the fact that according to tradition, you have to begin with a discourse about the making of the universe, cosmogony, and then ascend to theology, knowledge of God. Look at the universe and try to infer from the universe something about God. Which means what? You have to look at things from a theological viewpoint. You cannot look at things and arrive at the conclusion that there is a God if you don't have already faith. So this is a way of looking at things which pertains exclusively to people of faith, people that adhere to the doctrine of creation. But why I have selected this passage is because when he says exposition on cosmogony, that's his fancy way of saying Genesis 1. So the exposition on cosmogony is Genesis 1. So you look at the exposition on cosmogony in order to have perhaps the best introduction to theology, to the knowledge of God. His disciple, Origen, well, maybe a less delightful author in some milieux, this is how he begins his first homily on Genesis. It's an explanation of the first verse. And he gives the text. In the beginning God made heaven and earth. It's not the plural because Origen and many of the Greek fathers read the scriptures, the Old Testament, in Greek, not in Hebrew. In Hebrew, you know, it's heavens, plural. And that's his interpretation. What is the beginning of all things except our Lord and Savior of all, Jesus Christ, the firstborn of every creation? The italics refer to Colossians chapter 1, verse, 12 or something. 15. In this beginning, therefore, that is, in his word, his logos, God made heaven and earth. As the evangelist John also says in the beginning of his gospel, and he quotes the first 3 verses. Scripture is not speaking here of any temporal beginning, but it says that the heaven and the earth and all things which were made in the beginning, that is, in the Savior. What's the question that Origen tries to ask to? Who, what, where, how? Why? But what's the question that, look at the text, what's the question that he wants to answer? Is it when? Is it what? Is it why? Is it where? Or is it who? Who made it? In the beginning, yeah, God made. And Origen interprets the phrase in the beginning in Greek en archi. Origen interprets archi, which is also the term used by St. Paul in Colossians 1:15, as being Christ. So the question in Origen is not how did God do this and that, when did God this do or that. The question is who made it? It is God who made all things in his word, the Logos of God, the Creator. Yeah? And he confirms this understanding, this interpretation of Genesis 1:1 by referring to 2 New Testament passages, Colossians 1:15 and John 1, the first 3 verses. In both New Testament passages, the agent of creation is the Logos of God, the Word of God, Christ. that's how the early Christians looked at Genesis. Now, moving very quickly, because there isn't time, 4th century, Saint Basil the Great of Caesarea in Cappadocia, Asia Minor. He wrote this famous book known as Homilies on the Hexameron, the 6 days of creation. It's a line-by-line commentary on Genesis 1. And this is what he says about the first line. Again, in the beginning God made heaven and earth. The statement by anticipation of the dogmas concerning the world's consummation. Again, sorry, my language. I translated this one. So, the statement by anticipation of the dogmas concerning the world's consummation and transformation is now handed on briefly by way of the fundamentals pertaining to the divinely inspired teaching. We have a reference to Genesis as an inspired text. Yeah? The teaching or the doctrine of creation is divinely inspired. It is revealed to us. We embrace it through faith. That's something that most early Christians would say. There have been exceptions. Most early Christians would say that the scriptures are the inspired message of God, or a record of God's inspired message. But what he says about that first line in Genesis is mind-blowing, because he looks at Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God made heaven and earth, and instead of saying, well, this is how things started to be, he says it's a statement by anticipation with reference to things that will happen. The consummation of the universe means the eschaton, the final destiny of the universe, whatever that destiny is. And Basil looks at Genesis 1 verse 1, and instead of saying this is how things started to be, he says, well, this is a prophecy about the future, about the end of the creation. You tell me what's scientific about it. Maybe infantile teleology again, but at least that's our frame of mind. But this man, this saint, Basil the Great, in the 4th century, in relation to Genesis 1 verse 1, said, that's not only about the future, that's not only about the past, it's a prophecy about the future. It covers the entire history of the creation, from Alpha to Omega, from A to Z. You tell me where's the science in that, so that you can bring Genesis 1 to collision with I don't know what science, whether the science of today or that of yesterday, or that of tomorrow, for that matter. Saint Basil, he looks at Genesis as a heuristic device, as enticing you to explore, to make sense of things. It's something that you can use for your meditation, for your contemplation. He believed that Genesis was written by Moses. That's the traditional description of authorship. When Moses said, in the beginning God made the heaven and the earth, he passed over in silence many things such as water, air, and fire, out of which created beings happened to be produced. All these elements which completed the cosmos existed manifestly, without any doubt. But the story left them out so that our mind exercised its skills by inferring the rest from little pointers. Is Genesis a scientific textbook? A narrative of everything, a theory of everything? Does it explain everything? St. Basil says no. There are many things that are missing in that narrative. That narrative offers suggestions, pointers to things, but an inquisitive mind can fill the gaps if one is interested, for instance, in making things, sense of how things are. It proposes a continuation of the story, if you like. Then, we get to that point where I have to return to the question whether we have to be creationists or evolutionists for that matter. The same St. Basil, he refers to the second line in Genesis about chaos. And he says, due to the latent potentiality stored in it, in that darkness, initial chaos, by the demiurge, matter was in painful labors with the generation of all things, waiting for the auspicious times when, by a divine call, it would bring out into the open the things engendered within it. What is he talking about here? What's the subject of that sentence? Who does or what does the action? It's matter. It's the chaos. So there's like a dialogue, like a conversation between God, the creator, the demiurge, and that material chaos of the beginnings. And they work together, not one against the other. There's a potentiality of that material chaos wherefrom sprang our universe, but that did not happen automatically. That did not happen without God. Without the call of God, without a nudge from God, without a divine support. And St. Basil continues. This is from the third day when God creates vegetation. Let the earth bring forth. Think together with me how the cold earth, being stirred up towards bearing fruit and ever struggled in the pangs of travail, this small utterance and brief command produced myriads of sorts of plants, as though it casted away a gloomy and lamenting God, putting on instead one that was brighter and adorned with its proper ornaments. This is the earth now, our earth. It's not the original chaos. And the earth is like a mother, a childbearing mother. But the earth cannot give birth to things. Again, the mother is in need of a divine call, a divine nudge, the divine activity, the divine support. It's never either or, either God or the matter of the universe. The sixth day of creation. Let the earth bring forth a living soul, herds, wild animals and reptiles. He quotes from Genesis. Think of the word of God running through creation, still active now as it has been from the beginning and efficient until the end in order to bring the cosmos to fulfillment. This commandment remains active within the earth and does not cease from being of utmost service to the Maker. Thus, whereas certain animals are introduced from the existing ones through succession, some are shown forth as engendered out of the very earth even now. It's a process of continuous creation. But again, there are the two factors at play. There's the maternal dimension of the earth, cosmic energy, if you like, and there's the divine activity. And they interact, and that's how things happen. What we call natural phenomena are actually interactive or synergetic occurrences. Now, in this slide, what is Genesis 1? From my viewpoint, it's a key to unlock the mystery of the created existence by revealing the divine origin and purpose of the universe and the synergetic dimension of reality. Synergetic means, again, interactive. The divine energies and the cosmic energies interact continuously. And from this viewpoint, there's no room for either creationism or evolutionism. Genesis 1 establishes the creation as a theologically stamped reality, a theologically marked reality which speaks of God without requiring a certain science. Remember the mirroring of the days of creation. They do not require any science to confirm or infirm. It reports on the creation in a way that stirs the reader's inquisitiveness and desire to make sense of things. So we don't take it for granted. It's all that there is. So, is there creation or evolution? I think that's the wrong question. We have to abandon the logic of either or and follow in the footsteps of the early Christian theologians who were able to look at things, if you want to put it that way, as both creation and evolution. There's a divine activity at work in the universe, and there's the cosmic energy at work in the universe, and they interact continuously. That's nature. It's an event of continuous participation. So, from the viewpoint of the principle of synergy, it's creation and evolution, if this paradigm will hold. If tomorrow there's another theory instead of evolution, of course I'm certain that the doctrine of creation will be able to accommodate that too. So we're not nuts. And if you want to get a bit more of my idea of the principle of synergy and its implications for the topic of creation and evolution, there's a link there. I'll make the PowerPoint available to you. There's also something about me there. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Doru. It's always great having you, and we'll hope to get you out again soon. This is a bit of a preview, this topic, for our, we're going to have a week in October, the second week back after mid-semester break, and focus on this topic of science, religion, and miracles even. And talk about the interaction between all those things with a bunch of guest speakers. So keep your eye out for that. There's no class coming in here. I know if you have to go, you can go, that's fine. But if you've got time, maybe we have maybe 5 minutes or so for a few questions, since there's no class coming in here right now. So anyone have a question they'd like to ask?
I believe most Catholics anyway, especially older Catholics, take literally the creation story. Most Catholics would know that there's actually two. Genesis 1, I think, and Genesis 2. They're slightly different, I forget how they're different. I'm asking you, in terms of, we can touch on the creation of man and all that, the creation of Adam and Eve. The way it's described in Genesis is pretty literal. You know, out of nothing, out of dirt, God moulded something, spat in it, breathed life into it, and that's how man was made. Is that the church doctrine, that God made man in that way? Because I honestly believe that probably 90% of Catholics around the world, that's what they believe. And I don't know whether I'm right or wrong. I don't think that's what actually the church believes.
Yeah, well, let me be Byzantine.
Sorry?
Let me be Byzantine. You know, a guy from Byzantium, you know, sophisticated mind, being able to, you know, go through the labyrinth, avoid questions. My topic was about Genesis 1, not Genesis 2. Yeah, I understand what you say. Well, look.
As opposed to God creating everything,
yeah.
but the Bible doesn't say, isn't a scientific document as to how He created it.
Yeah.
It's just that He did create it.
Yeah.
That's the big difference.
Well, I believe that, really, I see your point, and I agree. And I believe that was my main point, that Genesis should be taken as a theological report on things, not a scientific, technological kind of description of how things have been made. Definitely, because of the difference between the two versions in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, actually in literature now they call them, for instance, Genesis 1 would be the narrative of creation, Genesis 2 would be the narrative of paradise. They are written with different tools. Stylistically, they are very different stories. Their angles are different, but they share in common one point, that same theological dimension. In other words, they refer everything to God. To be less Byzantine, I'll say this to you, but that's my personal conviction. that the way Genesis 1 should not be taken as a scientific textbook, the same way the Genesis 2 narrative of the making of the human being out of the dust of the earth and that, again should be taken as a theological metaphor which conveys a theological meaning. I have mentioned in my talk a name, although I haven't presented anything from him, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, the younger brother to Saint Basil the Great. Saint Gregory of Nyssa wrote one of the first interpretations, early Christian interpretations of Genesis 2 and 3. So the paradise narrative. And he called that story of paradise, particularly that verse 7 in Genesis 2, with the making of the dust of the earth, the breath of life, and then the human being is put in paradise. He called that mystical anthropogenesis. Mystical means something that you cannot make sense of in rational terms. There's something about an intimacy between God and the human being that is hinted at there. It's not, again, a matter of the technology of the creation. This is how God actually did. God having hands, took some dirt, spat on, molded there a golem, and then the golem was plugged in, and got life in. What Gregory says, and he's not the only father of the church to look at things in this way, is that Genesis chapter 2 verse 7, with the molding of the human being, is a metaphor of the human being's remaking, a spiritual experience. You can take that literally. It's good for catechism, I guess. But then think again of what Gregory's brother Basil said. The text only gives you hints, pointers to how things actually happened. And now, as a person of the 21st century, you can fill the gaps in the narrative, by, for instance, the knowledge of our time, the sciences of our time, if that's what you wish. Which is why my hypothesis was we can even use the theory of evolution, not evolutionism, though. Because evolutionism doesn't have anything in common with the theological viewpoint with God, and therefore is unusable. But if that's your whim, you can fill in the gaps of the theological narrative of Genesis by referring to details of the sciences, or provided by the sciences of our time. But you can skip all that if your interest is, and I believe that's why we read Genesis as scripture. If your interest is in formation, personal transformation, then you'll ask different questions. Why, for instance, the Orthodox read the first chapters of Genesis in the beginning of Lent, when for all traditional Christians, it's a time of spiritual remaking of the person. Lent is a time of spiritual growth, redefinition. Why reading Genesis then? It's because I believe there's this intuition that Genesis is a story that can motivate me, puts me in the right frame of mind, equips me with the right tools to ask the right questions about myself. Where am I? With reference to the tree of life or the tree of knowledge, and so on and so forth. These are different questions, and therefore you don't need the science anyway. But, I repeat, what should be understood is that this text was never written in order to give us scientific information. Neither of the two narratives, creation and paradise.
Any other pressing questions?
evolutionism.
Yeah. The thing is that I think for most people that, I mean, once again, I might be interpreting what you meant by evolutionism, but if you're referring to evolutionists as believing that evolution explains all, essentially, if you were to speak to scientists about evolution in that sense, I don't think any would say that evolution, they see evolution as a dogma. They see it as like you said, a way of explaining reality in the most evidenced way we can. So I was just, I'm not sure where I was going with that, apart from just commenting on things, but yeah.
If I may barge in, we need a distinction between description and interpretation. And this is where the confusion usually crops up, because we don't make that distinction. We believe that description and interpretation are the same, and they aren't. Let me keep it on my turf. Creation and creationism. Creation is an interpretation. It's a theological viewpoint on reality. In the beginning, God made everything. Yeah? That's a theological viewpoint. It's an interpretation of reality, wherefrom the entire existence becomes meaningful and purposeful. We're not lost, isolated, abandoned, and so on and so forth. There's something to think about. There's something positive in the world, and we have to discover that and live for it. Yeah? Creationism is an interpretation that changes entirely the angle, trying to explain how things happened. Yeah? How things happened. That's a description. And this is where I disagree with creationism, because the doctrine of creation inspired by the scriptures cannot be tweaked that way. The scriptures do not offer a description of the universe. Remember the mirroring days. That's not a description of the universe. That's a representation, a theological representation. Yeah. When you tweak that text, that document, and you want that document to answer the question, how have been things done? What actually happened? That's more like a description, and it requires science, not a kind of science like creationism. It's, I think, the same with evolution and evolutionism. Evolution, the theory of evolution tries to give a description of things. That's how things work. These are the phenomena. This is how life works. Mitochondrial, whatever, stuff, yeah? Genes and that, blue genes and that. Evolutionism tried to transform that into something that is not. It's an ideology. Evolutionism, it's an ideology that wants to put a whatever equal between description and interpretation. And it says, well, let me be trivial and say something like this, because the genes exist, there's no God. That's evolutionism. That's an ideology. That's an interpretation that pretends to be a description.
See, I don't think any scientist would say that.
Well, actually, there's Dawkins, who's a smart man, but sometimes because of his whatever effervescent mind, walks, that wild side, on that wild side, and he doesn't know what he wants to say. Because the genes exist, there's no God. Yeah, that's not a description. That's an interpretation. It's ideologically biased description. I have no problem with you guys describing the processes of nature, whatever happens at the level of the cell or between the cells, and so on and so forth. I actually enjoy reading that kind of stuff. That's how I bumped into that article initially. But you don't tell me that your description contains its interpretation, and that interpretation excludes God and purpose and meaning. That's my point. That's why I can't be an evolutionist.
We might have to just finish it there, but